Hello everybody, Dr. Stringer back again. We are on to Module 10 this week. Today we're talking about the CSI Effect. And so, you're thinking about the CSI Effect. This is an interesting thing that many of you probably don't know what it is. And the CSI Effect is more of a societal reaction to technology rather than the criminal's use of technology or police's use of technology to try to thwart crime, but it's more so really the way that we think about society and jurors starting to expect that things like DNA and technological innovation such as that will actually be presented to them at trial. And so we're going to talk about how these things have actually changed the ability for juries to actually convict people because they are expecting these things. And so, like I said in your slide here, it says, are we dealing directly with technology? And no, we're not dealing directly with technology. We're looking at kind of these indirect effects of technology. And so instead we're looking at issues related to possible unintended consequences, such as DNA testing and other hard sciences, technological innovations, and how they're being proven and reliable. And so this can help to inform policymakers to make shifts and see how technology impacts things beyond the actual goals, which is another thing that we've been looking at when we think about technology in this class. Is the technology working to do what it's supposed to be occurring, and then is it having any unintended consequences? Which these unintended consequences are actually what we're going to spend the bulk of the lecture talking about today when we talk about the CSI Effect. And so this week you had two readings to look over. That was the Robbers and the Rebecca Haynes, Smith, and Levitt articles. And I'm going to talk about a little bit a couple other things too as we move forward. So just to get a little started here, the CSI Effect, what is it? The CSI Effect refers to this phenomenon which purports that jurors have this unrealistic expectation of having forensic evidence and investigation techniques and things like that, and have increased the interest in the discipline of forensic science because of the influence of these CSI-type television shows. So this is very true. I mean, you think about CSI, there's CSI Miami, Los Angeles, and a bunch of different ones. I don't remember how many different cities they have now. But in CSI, they almost always find some sort of DNA evidence, don't they? And they almost always are able to conclusively examine this evidence and then present it to the jury and say, well, we found the DNA, and here it is, and we're going to use that to convict the people. But one of the things that's most important about this is that in reality, it's not really that is the case. Rarely is DNA evidence is ever found, depending upon different types of crimes. But even more so, are they able to conclusively match this DNA to somebody? So if they have a suspect, then they can match it to that person. But if they find some DNA and this person is not in the database, the DNA is not there, then there's no one to match it to. And so this is an interesting thing recently that came up with looking at Ancestry.com because they were able to match the DNA strand of a serial killer from like 30 years ago from California because he was not in any database. They had the DNA that they'd collected, his DNA, but they were never able to identify him because he was not in any database. He'd never been convicted of anything that would require him to be in the database. And so they had the DNA, but they didn't know who the DNA belonged to. But then one of this person's relatives was submitting things to Ancestry.com, and so then they were able to trace the DNA from that person to the serial killer and arrested him 30 years later. He was an old person and, wasn't probably killing anyone anymore and probably thought he'd gotten away with it until they came to knock on his door. But in reality, the CSI Effect is said to raise the state's burden of proof because of this, what is known to be an unreasonable expectation of DNA evidence. And so the juries are oftentimes wanting to see this a lot, and if they don't see it, then they think that there's not enough evidence, or that maybe there was some DNA and it got excluded for some reason, or something like that. And so this is just a chart here. It's not from your readings, but it looks at the NIJ, and I'm sorry, this comes from the NIJ, the National Institute of Justice, and it looks at percentage of jurors who expect scientific evidence from the prosecution. And if you look at DNA down here at the bottom, you'll see, in every case there's only about 20%, a little bit more, that expect DNA evidence. In murders, it gets up a little bit to about 45, but then looking at assaults, it's much lower. But in rape cases, almost about 70, probably about 73% of jurors said that they expect to see some sort of DNA evidence there. And then, of course, it goes down with breaking and entering and theft and crimes involving a gun, things like that, for DNA. And then you could look at, ballistics, things like that. Crimes involving a gun, you almost always want to see some ballistic evidence there. It's pretty high with murders as well. But every other type of thing, you don't really want to see ballistics. And, fingerprints, this one is pretty similar for murder with ballistics. Then it goes down. Breaking and entering, they tend to want to see a lot of fingerprint evidence for breaking and entering, or even a theft or a crime involving a gun. There's a high expectation that you should present some sort of fingerprint evidence. And looking at, just scientific evidence of any kind. For murder, that's even higher. They want to see 73%, pretty high there. Assault, looks like you might be able to get away with having a little bit less. Then it goes back up again for rape. Breaking and entering is a little bit less than 50%, and things like that. So you see how there's a high expectation that you should present some sort of scientific evidence, and it varies significantly across different types of crimes. With rapes and murders and more serious offenses, almost always they want to see these types of things. And the CSI effect gets at the fact that, well, if the jurors want to see this and you don't give it to them, then they're going to be less likely to convict the person just because they haven't seen this evidence that they expect to see based upon watching CSI shows and things like that. And so here's just something that comes from a different article that was not part of your readings today, which is Cole and Diosa Villa. And so should judges worry about the CSI effect? And so one of the other things, too, that is interesting, the CSI effect, part of it, which I would argue is probably a good thing, at least for people in my profession, is that, at the bottom here you have this educators and effect on students. Well, the CSI TV shows and things like that have done a very good job at romanticizing the criminal justice field and forensics and things like that. And so more people have actually started majoring in the field because they find it to be interesting. So then, like I said, the effect on jurors is they afford greater credibility to forensic experts. Other things, the effect on prosecutors is that they're forced to compensate for the absences or weaknesses of forensics evidence by not having it or having weak forensic evidence, things like that. And then, the other effect on jurors is they might acquit people in cases in which they would have convicted individuals had CSI never existed or had they never been exposed to the CSI shows and the CSI effect, so to speak. So the first article that you had to read was the Robbers 2009 article, which measures the distance between artistic portrayals of the criminal justice system and the reality of the criminal justice system. And so they don't mean distance as in, feet or yards, miles, things like that. They're really talking about this idea of social distance. And they get into, in the title of it, it talks about social constructionism. And this is a very interesting thing. It's a very complex issue, but it really gets at this idea that reality, on the one hand, is different from perceptions of reality. And so really what they're doing is measuring the distance between objective reality and subjective reality, if you will. So what is the perception of the reality of the system based upon the jurors, and what is the actual objective reality? So, you know, there's a lot of literature on this and a lot of theory that talks about how we all live in our own reality. We don't all see the same things the same way. The CSI Effect is going to influence different people different ways. People who have watched CSI are going to look at evidence presented to them in the jury box as much differently than those people who have had different reactions or different exposure to these CSI shows. So she asked another important question: does society's expectation of the criminal justice system, which are influenced by artistic portrayals, influence criminal jury trials? And if the answer is yes, there is a serious problem, right? Should TV shows be influencing the criminal justice system and convictions, or acquittals for that matter? We don't want fictional stories that are being portrayed in CSI to influence whether guilty murderers and serial killers are going free. On the other hand, we don't want them to influence whether innocent people are being imprisoned either. So these are all very important things excuse me, to think about as we move forward and think about these things. So who were the respondents? Well, they actually looked at a lot of different actors within the courtroom community, if you will. So there was 290 people, 60% of them were male, 48.62 was the average age, 77% white. They had a different makeup of judges, prosecutors, and defense attorneys, which is about equal. It's about 30% judges, 34% prosecutors, and 33% defense attorneys, to see whether these people thought that people's exposure to CSI had influenced the jury trials. And so they found that 79% of the sample believed that jurors had made decisions that were influenced by forensic television programs such as CSI. There's also NCIS and other ones too, but CSI was the first one, so they coined the term the CSI Effect. And so they also found that jurors would discount eyewitness testimony, which, I have issues with eyewitness testimony anyway, because you have eyewitness testimony is the most unreliable piece of evidence that we have, and almost everybody that has been wrongfully convicted and found to be innocent later on has been convicted based upon eyewitness testimony. And if you take my policing class or my criminal procedure class, we'll get into a lot of the problems with eyewitness testimony, but that's neither here nor there for these purposes. But anyway, so jurors may have seen a lack of forensic testing as sloppy police work. So when they don't see this stuff presented to them, they think that the police officers have messed up in some way, shape, or form, and that's why they haven't seen it. Jurors have also requested to see irrelevant forensic evidence. So even if it's not relevant, they want to see it. And then there's a negative view of witnesses as well. So we don't believe the witnesses as much when we don't get to see this forensic evidence that that jurors think that they should be presented. So 85% of the sample of the judges, the lawyers, and prosecutors believe that their job had changed in some way because of the CSI Effect. They say that more of their time was dedicated to discussing forensic evidence. They spent more time on the voir dire to find out if jurors who have difficulty distinguishing television from reality, I do my best to have them bumped from the jury because you really need to be able to realize that, okay, this is a television show. That doesn't mean that it's actually true, that this is actual reality. And hopefully if you take anything away from this lecture or your major as a whole, if you're criminal justice majors, will be that, just because something is on TV doesn't mean that that's the way it is in reality. It's almost never the case. There's so much that goes into creating media and even watching the news today. There's a lot that goes into twisting and turning it to make it interesting to you that kind of takes away from what actually happened. And there's been a lot of research on that too, so we won't go there. But anyway, and then the respondents also said that they spent more time familiarizing themselves with forensic tests because they have to be able to understand them as well to try to explain them to the jury. And so it's a very complicated issue, and of course the prosecutor is going to explain it the way that benefits him, and then the defense is going to have a different interpretation and different witnesses, different expert witnesses to explain it different ways. And of course, at the end of the day, the jury probably doesn't understand much of it anyway. So nearly 70% of the respondents believe that jurors had unrealistic expectations of forensic evidence and police work. And there's a quote directly from there. It says, the jurors have unreasonable expectation when it comes to forensic evidence. They believe every case should have some kind of DNA evidence. They expect all police officers to spend the time and resources to investigate cases the way they make cases on TV. And so, like I said, not every case is going to have some DNA evidence. And you can't just believe that because it's not there that the police officers have messed up or not done their job fully. If you have a bicycle stolen, there's probably not going to be any DNA evidence because your bicycle is gone. And if it's any kind of crime that occurs in a public place, you could scrape the sidewalks or the side of the street for DNA, but you're going to find DNA from thousands or if not hundreds or whatever amount of people. That doesn't really help your case very much. And so these are things to think about when you're moving forward. So how does television and the crime show viewing influence jurors' evaluations of the evidence? So Roberts examined CJ actors, the perceptions of whether the CSI Effect influenced juror expectations and or decisions. But the second article that you were to read was the Haynes, Smith, and Levitt article, which did not just look at actors in the criminal justice system, judges and lawyers and prosecutors, but it actually used dismissed jurors, so people that had actually been called for jury duty and then were dismissed from the jury during the voir dire process. And so these were people that would have actually been jurors, but then they ended up not being on the jury. So the purpose of the study there was to examine whether jurors' crime show viewing habits interact with the amount of forensic evidence to affect trial decisions. So if you think about, you have an amount of evidence, and so when you reach a certain amount of evidence, that should be proof beyond a reasonable doubt. But does the number of times that someone watches CSI or some other sort of forensic show influence how high that has to be? And so do these things interact? It's kind of a complex statistical method is interaction to try to explain to you all. But thinking about, okay, so if you haven't watched CSI at all, is your willingness to convict based upon, just say, an arbitrary number of 10? 10 being the maximum amount of evidence that's been proven. Out of 10, you have a level of evidence on a scale of 1 to 10. And so if you haven't watched CSI at all, then at a 10, you would probably be willing to convict this person, right? But if you watch CSI a lot, then you might want more than a 10. You might want a 15 because you're demanding that you see this forensic evidence and DNA evidence and things like that. So this is really what they're looking at. So the jury's still out, the research methods on this. So they had 104 dismissed jurors from a southern courthouse, 51% male, average age is about 42, 75% white. They used random assignment of participants to a staged felony assault trial containing one of 3 levels of forensic evidence. So rather than have a scale of 1 to 10, they had 3 different levels, so it would be 1 to 3, of 3 different levels of forensic evidence. So the vignette was based on an actual case in which a defendant was convicted of aggravated assault. Prosecutor 3 witnesses: the ex-girlfriend's victim, a military staff sergeant who retrieved the weapon from the defendant's vehicle, and a police sergeant. All right, and the defense, the defendant testified for himself, so that was the evidence. So looking at all 3 levels of evidence, received the same vignette and testimony. However, each had a different strength of evidence. So in Group A, they were given no forensic evidence whatsoever. In Group B, they had some fingerprint analysis, which fingerprints were found on the gun. And then in Group C, they had fingerprint analysis on the gun, as well as some ballistic evidence that matched the defendant. So the real case in which this is based on had no forensic evidence. So they're actually adding this into the hypothetical scenario. So the independent variables were the level of forensic evidence. Like I said, you either have none, you have just the fingerprints, or you have the fingerprints and the ballistic evidence. And then the crime viewing behavior. So they operationalize this as how many hours spent watching crime TV shows, and how much time spent watching TV altogether. And so the dependent variables in this article, this study, if you will, were the trial decisions. So confidence in guilty or not guilty decision, and confidence that the defendant committed the crime. So the strength of the evidence was rated by people on a 7-point scale. All right, and so whether participants found the defendant guilty was not impacted by the level of evidence. So it didn't matter whether you had no forensic evidence. It didn't matter whether you had the bullet or the fingerprints on the gun, or it didn't matter whether you had the fingerprints on the gun and the ballistic evidence. None of this mattered. What mattered was how much time people spent watching crime shows. So when people watched crime shows a lot, then they wanted to see more evidence. And so then, and only then, would they convict. But the people who hadn't watched the shows at all, they were more likely to convict people, and they didn't care about the level of evidence either. So this is interesting, right? So it doesn't really matter the level of evidence. The amount of evidence that you have is really about how much the jurors watched CSI, which is a very frightening conclusion to come to for our criminal justice system. And this really gets at the idea of these unintended consequences of of technology. And so, the final thing is that those who watch crime shows were more likely to favor the defendant than those who did not. So and by that, I mean those that watched crime shows were more likely to acquit the defendant than those people who did not. And this doesn't seem to matter based upon the level of evidence. So, do jurors understand DNA evidence? So this is a really good question. I have a PhD, I have a master's degree, I have a bachelor's degree, I've got several degrees. And I understand the idea of DNA, I understand what it means, but to get at the science behind it and the math, well, I don't know about all of that. I don't really completely understand it. I can talk to you about it, but if you guys wanted to get into that kind of stuff, that's more of something that you would probably look at taking maybe some biology or some more biology other than what you would take in high school and undergraduate, just as your general education science courses. Because looking at the actual science, which is actually very sound behind DNA, is a very complicated issue which goes beyond what most people would understand. And so jurors are pulled from the public. So is the public educated enough to understand the science? Most people have, 40% of Americans hold a bachelor's or an associate's degree. So that's about 60% of the society that holds less than that, that just has a high school diploma or less. An even smaller amount has a bachelor's degree, and I think it's less than 2% of the country has a PhD. So maybe if you have I would hope that if you have a PhD in biology, you'd be able to understand this whole, DNA, the science behind it and all. But can we expect the average juror to do so? And so that's one of the big limitations about this. So, what makes someone a good juror? So collectively, jurors showed a good comprehension of DNA, but they still made errors. So they did explain it to them, and they understood it somewhat, but they made errors in their understanding of it. So what might influence someone's understanding of the science? Well, higher education, educational background in the STEM sciences, biology, and things like that. That's going to help you to understand this stuff a lot more than being a criminologist, unless you're a forensic criminologist, then you know all of that stuff and you're very versed in the biology side of that science. But anyway, what are the implications from all of this? Well, the other things to think about is when presented with science in a courtroom setting, jurors have a varying degree of understanding based upon their backgrounds. There's professional juries, educational requirements, and things to think about, right? So the CSI effect, it might be real. If it is, it causes a major problem for the court system, right? If we're convicting people or acquitting people based upon, whether or not the jury watched CSI, then this is a big problem. Especially when it seems to influence things that are so important, and people are on trial for their lives oftentimes. In areas where they're going to have the death penalty and things, this becomes even more serious. The stakes are very high, like I said. We don't want to see guilty people go free, or innocent people get sentenced to prison because jurors, attorneys, judges, or whoever don't understand the science that they're using, or there's just not the science there, and the jury is demanding to see it. So the myth of DNA, rarely a critical factor in solving crimes. The greatest successes in DNA has actually been in actually exonerating people who were convicted falsely, rather than it is with convicting people to the get-go. Most of the people that have been exonerated in recent years, like I said, have been convicted based upon eyewitness testimony, but they've been exonerated because DNA evidence has come to light, or DNA technology has also gotten much better than it used to be most of the time when these people were convicted. And so a lot of times what had happened, these people that are getting released, is they were convicted several years ago, not several years ago, several decades ago, back when, DNA evidence was so elementary that they would oftentimes just look at blood types, and it would be like, well, this person, the defendant has blood type O positive, and the killer had blood type O positive, so we're matching that together. As well as, of course, that wouldn't be the only evidence. There would be, eyewitness testimony and other things like that to go along with it. But then, there's a lot of people out there that are O positive. They say, there are no two people that have the same DNA in the entire world. DNA matching is like a fingerprint. Nobody has the exact same fingerprint. They do say that, I think, there's a certain type of twin, and it escapes me now. Identical twins have the same DNA, but other than that, no one has the same DNA. Of course, I always criticize this as kind of like I do with fingerprints. Is like, well, we say that nobody has the same, but we haven't found anyone that does yet. But we haven't checked everybody, so we're making kind of an assumption there. At this point, the assumption hasn't been proven wrong, but Einstein's theory of relativity was proven to be false a few years ago too. So, as science evolves, these are all things to think about. But then again, like I said, I do not understand the science, or do not pretend to all the details of DNA matching and all of that stuff. But it is key to solving crimes. Information about a specific suspect is most important. But if the police have little to no information at the beginning of their involvement, the chances of the crime being cleared is very low. So, it really depends on the characteristics of the crime rather than the presence of the DNA. Like the example I gave earlier, even if you do find some DNA, you find the DNA at the scene, but if you don't have some information on a suspect to match that DNA to, then it doesn't help you at all, unless, maybe that person has already been convicted of a felony, and in case you all don't know, when you're convicted of a felony now, you're required to go and deposit your DNA into the CODIS system, and then you're in this federal database which keeps track of everybody who is a convicted felon's DNA. So if you do convict or come to find some DNA where you don't have a suspect, that can help you, but if they're not in that database, then it doesn't help you. So anyway, that concludes our lecture on DNA and the CSI effect and all of those good things that we're talking about today. And so I would hope that when you all are out on a jury someday, you'll think, well, let's think about this. We want to see some cool forensic evidence, but maybe we don't need to. Maybe if they are presenting it, we need to think about this critically and look at all of the evidence too. But anyway, so with that, I will sign off and wish you all a good week, and I'll see you next week.